Thank you. Let me start by thanking members of the Town Commission for inviting me to the briefing today. Our staff in Bangladesh and other colleagues of theirs who work on human rights issues in Bangladesh, to them it's very inspiring that thousands of miles away from Bangladesh, so many people can gather to hear about the situation there. I mentioned the European Parliament resolution that was passed this morning, which copies of which are right here. It's equally inspiring that in Brussels, thousands of miles from here, also all of this attention is being paid. It's very important to them knowing and fighting for human rights there that sort of attention is happening. And in that sense, this hearing is extraordinarily timely and important. So look, Bangladesh's political situation, let me be clear, is in crisis. But to best understand the country's current problems, a quick review of recent history is in order. So I'll just provide a very brief overview of how we got here. The ruling Awami League, headed by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, has been in power since 2009. And in the most recent election, Sheikh Hasina won a second term in January 2014. But this was only after the primary opposition parties boycotted the polls. The opposition had held protests before the elections, many of which were violent, demanding that elections be held under an impartial caretaker government. Hasina refused, leading to boycott. With half the seats uncontested, the Awami League ran unopposed, and since then the country has essentially been a one-party state. National elections are now scheduled for December 30th of this year, and the government has again rejected opposition demands for a neutral caretaker government of sorts to be appointed. But this time, opposition parties have announced their participation and will run, although they are requesting international observers to ensure a more free and fair polling. The government, unfortunately, is not agreeing to those terms. Now, look, there's no reason to think that these elections are going to be conducted in a fully free and fair atmosphere right now. Over the last year, authorities have detained or jailed, in other respects, many senior opposition leaders. They've lodged politically motivated, trumped-up legal cases against thousands of opposition supporters and violated international standards on freedom of speech by cracking down on media and civil society who are critical of government abuses, even if they're not part of civil society. And human rights groups have remained under pressure due to restrictions on their funding. Journalists have reported threats and intimidation to prevent criticism of the government. But let me now provide some details of what I'm talking about more precisely. Before I do that, though, I just need to make clear, Human Rights Watch is not a partisan organization. You may hear me speaking of the opposition and the ruling party, but we take no position for or against any political party. And I think if you look on our records, if you look at our website, for instance, you'll see that Human Rights Watch was critical of human rights abuses by the Bangladeshi government, no matter who is in power. And if you consult the old pages, you will see that when the current opposition party was in power, we were critical of them as a ruling party. So Human Rights Watch has no political agenda for or against any political party. Our primary concern is with the human rights abuses that are being committed in the country. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So let me give you a quick overview of the contours of the crackdown. First, as I'm sure almost everybody in this room knows, the leader of the primary opposition group, the Bangladesh National Party, Khalida Zia, is in jail. The government jailed her in February in connection with several long-standing corruption cases. Aside from the specific merits of those cases, opposition party supporters view Zia's prosecution as motivated politically, motivated by the political agenda of the Awami League. And what they point out is that the charges against her were brought by the military government that preceded Sheikh Hasina's rule, and that government had also brought charges against Sheikh Hasina. Those charges against Sheikh Hasina were dropped when she came to power. The charges against Zia proceeded. But look, the crackdown is about more than just Zia's detention. The government has, in other months since then, filed trumped-up charges against thousands of other opposition supporters, and The BNP, for its part, is claiming that they have documented at least 5,000 new arrests, including 1,000 that they provided information to the government. But beyond the arrests, I mean, the numbers of persons accused in court documents are so extensive that some media, have found people who are dead on the list of people who have been charged. I mean, there's just such a broad number of names that are being thrown out. It's a broad crackdown. It's really hard to tell how many people have been detained politically, but there is a little bit to be glimpsed in the overall population change in Bangladesh's jail population in recent months. There's been approximately 14,000 to 15,000 new prisoners since September. Some of those are just ordinary criminal cases, but with an increase of that size, it gives you a sense of how big this crackdown might be. And there's also been a lot of disappearances. I mean, we've documented at least 19 BNP supporters in recent years who have simply disappeared, and we don't even know whether they're detained in jails. And there may be additional cases, but the numbers are quite likely far higher. The word that many people use when describing this whole atmosphere in Bangladesh right now is fear. I hear things like hundreds of people have disappeared. We don't know where they are. Fear, suspicion, tension, threats, a culture of fear, an environment of fear. A newspaper editor said, as an editor, I should have to decide what to publish. I need to save my reporters from intimidation. So many people predict that when the election takes place, it will be in fair atmospheres, and then it will be rigged to benefit the Awami League, and that violence will likely occur in the aftermath. So that's one of the most serious problems facing us. We've seen a lot of violence by the security forces over the recent years. We wrote an entire report on our website about kneecapping, the phenomenon where security forces take opposition members into custody and then shoot them in the leg or in the kneecap, often leading to permanent disability. This has especially been used against youth members of the Jamaat party. So you can go on our website and read about that. But there's egregious and recent cases of brutality from this summer when student protests were broken up by both police and security forces, but also the youth wings of and student wings of the Awami League party. Very violent protests, which, by the way, led to the detention of a photojournalist and activist, Shahidul Alam, whose work documenting those protests and criticizing the government crackdown appears to have directly led to his arrest in August. He was granted bail this morning, but he remains in detention as of right now as the government appeals that decision. So that's a continuing case of concern. In my written remarks, I also talk about something we can talk about in the Q&A, which is the Digital Security Act, which we see as a problematic law, has language that essentially allows the government to lock up whoever they want for critical statements. I also think we can talk in the Q&A about the Rohingya crisis and the effects that that's having on the way it fits into the political crisis. This morning, the government came very close to beginning a repatriation of a small number of Rohingya refugees, but an enormous international outcry appears to have led them to suspend that when they also simultaneously realized in Cox's Bazar that there were no Rohingya to be found who wanted to go back to Burma. So I can talk about that in the Q&A too. Last thing I'm going to say, just I know I'm over time, the recommendations, what we need to talk about, both here and in the Q&A afterwards, is what can the U.S. government do about this? The Trump administration doesn't have a great amount of credibility on human rights issues right now for various reasons that I won't go into. But Congress does have a role to play as 1/3 of the U.S. government. The United States Congress is part of the United States government, and they can flex their muscles in terms of communicating to the Bangladeshi government that it expects this crackdown to be eased and for free and fair elections to happen, and if there are many pieces of leverage from military to military ties and assistance to tariff issues and things that are negotiated by the U.S. Trade Representative, but also hard sanctions. Members of the security forces implicated in gross human rights abuses can be sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act, and that's also something that might get Bangladesh's attention. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. The point is, Congress can play a huge role on the Bangladesh situation by either imposing new provisions in law or urging the State Department to use existing authorities to either sanction or incentivize or disincentivize the Bangladesh government. And we really ought, the United States Congress really ought to do that. Thank you.